I wonder whether they were thinking at the time, well, what does it look like when we end segregation in this country? We get the Civil Rights Act in, and where does it go? That's where we should be, I think, to think, well, what does equality look like? Is it a destination? Does it require constant maintenance? Are the historical tools of liberation now impediments to our continued embedded existence in the society? Those are the questions that I'm interested in.
Hello and welcome back to On the Couch with Clare. My name is Clare Rowe, and this is the show where we are speaking candidly about culture, identity, family, and the issues shaping our children today. Today's conversation is one I have been really looking forward to. I am joined by Jack Ayoub, who is, amongst other things, a union organiser, a former federal political candidate, a bloody good opera singer. I only just discovered that and looked that up, so go and have a look at that. And I think a deeply thoughtful voice who has recently stirred up some conversation with an article in The Australian that I saw, and that is why I got in contact with Jack. His article is titled, LGBTQIA+ doesn't speak for me. It's time to dismantle the Rainbow Alliance. I think Jack's piece is pretty bold. It's obviously deeply personal. And whether you agree with him or not, it is undeniably courageous. In the piece, he questions the direction of the modern LGBTQI+ movement and its alignment with the radical gender ideology and the way it often speaks as a monolith for people with vastly different experiences and beliefs. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to dig deep into Jack's life story, hopefully, growing up in Western New South Wales and struggling with literacy as a child, which you would not pick reading this extremely articulate article. So I really respect Jack for agreeing to come onto this podcast. I think he's clearly not here to fight in the culture wars, but has come to speak truthfully, and I think that you will find his honesty not only refreshing, but I think very necessary. So with that introduction, welcome, Jack. It's so lovely to meet you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. So first of all, you wrote this piece, and we'll get to that maybe in a little bit, but I read it and it just stood out for me, as I said, refreshing and something that I thought would resonate with a lot of people. Now, if I get this right, I'm going to kind of say what I took from it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I took from it is someone as growing up as a gay man was saying that from the moment you expressed or acknowledged same-sex attraction, you were seemingly recruited into a community. And communities are great, but it was a community that just because you are a gay person, therefore you ought to think, speak, act, hold the same views as a whole bunch of people. I mean, millions of people.
Yes.
And by definition of being gay, that was what you should think and feel and act. And I like the part particularly where you pointed out the forebearers of gay rights movements in the, throughout the decades before us and their fight for freedom to be whoever you are. And have we kind of regressed or in some way met full circle back to say, well, as a gay person, apparently I can't be who I want to be with my own views. I have to be part of the community that now speaks for me. Have I got that right?
Yes, I think, I wrote it with the intention that each person who read it would grasp their own interpretation, and yours is certainly a valid one, as is everyone's, even those who take a negative position, of course. But ultimately, yes, what I was trying to say is that to assume that one sexuality is the most prominent part of them is to greatly reduce the vibrancy of an individual. Individuals are complicated beings. They have so many different interests and so on. And that what the acronym did or does in the sort of mind of the community at large and the zeitgeist of the community is to say, well, if you come across a gay person, here are the key tenets they're going to believe in. Here's what they're going to look like. Here's what they're going to sound like. And whilst there are similarities amongst gay men, there are also many differences. Same with lesbians, same with bisexual, exactly, same with bisexual people, same with transgender people. And it always struck me as someone who is still, and in this desperate search for belonging, which I think we all are in some deep way, it struck me as odd that you would cut yourself off from the broader society. It's a much more powerful thing to be embedded in the broader society and happen to be gay. And, I'll share an anecdote with you that really, an experience that was very powerful for me, watching Stephen Fry on QI. I must have been 15 or something.
Love Stephen Fry.
Great, magnificent person. And I knew in myself that I was gay, and I'm watching this guy, and I was captivated by him, really quite captivated by him. And for whatever reason, I thought, I want to know more about this person. And so I set to Googling, and I happened to find out that he's gay. That was a very powerful moment for me, because here he was Stephen Fry, happened to be gay.
Yes.
He wasn't a gay guy named Stephen Fry, as great a ring as that has to it. And so I think, in essence, you are right. That is the central theme, is that why do we reduce human beings to their sexuality, particularly in a society where the struggles aren't as severe as they once were?
Okay, well, we might come back to that. I do want to ask about your experience. You grew up in Western New South Wales. How far west?
So I grew up in a little place called Coonabarabran, and partly in Barradine. The people of Barradine will claim as much as the people of Coonabarabran. So it's about 6.5 hours drive from Sydney.
Okay.
It's the central west. So people know Dubbo. You go another hour and 40 minutes and you're in Coonabarabran, which is a town of 2,500 people. And that's where my formative years were spent. I grew up there with my first sort of memory being in the hospital ward with my mother, who had cancer, and she died when I was 11. And within quick succession of her dying, Dad fell off a roof. He'd been a roof plumber and he was badly disabled. He'd never worked again properly. And the frustration of that meant that he developed a bad gambling habit. So once Mum died, I was living with Dad, and, it was pretty tough, an overused phrase, but it was pretty tough, to the point where I remember on occasion we would go and trap rabbits, bring them home to Mary and Colleen next door, and they would skin them and cook them because Dad had been at the TAB and the disability check was gone.
Wow.
That was kind of my formative years, and it taught me a lot of things, and a lot of that was Dad's values too, I really feel. I remember going to a barbecue, and my dad had a fundamental belief you never went to anyone's house without something to share. And the only thing we had to share was a half packet of milk arrowroot biscuits. And I can still remember the red rubber band around them. And he put them on the table and we shared them, and nobody batted an eyelid. It was that kind of community. So, that was my growing up. And at some point, about 16, I think, Mary and Colleen next door bought me a DVD of The Three Tenors in Rome in 1990. And I listened to that. The first thing I heard was Jose Carrera singing "E la solita storia del pastore." And away it went. And I started imitating them and figured out I could half do it. That, meant that my music teacher picked up on that and thought, look, you ought to go and audition at the Sydney Conservatorium, and thought, all right, we'll do that. So I went and auditioned. And right through this, the value of education, my dad left school in year 6, what the equivalent was. He left very early, and a lot of criminality in his early life. He was a rough guy before he sort of straightened himself up. He didn't value education necessarily. And my literacy and numeracy was terrible. I wasn't reading in high school, really. I have no shame in saying that my ATAR was 51, 52. I wasn't book smart, but had some other intelligence. And so that was a real struggle for me.
Was that through lack of application, motivation, exposure to teaching from yourself, or was that more of a learning difficulty, dyslexia or something like that?
There's probably some element of that. I think, I was a pretty sad kid. Dad was not in a good place. Home was difficult. I remember it may seem silly, but, I only had one school uniform that I wore every day. It faded and ripped before everyone else's. You notice that stuff. My dear, dear friend Eddie Wilkin used to bring me extra lunch sometimes. School was a tough time for me. And so learning was kind of low on the list. I was a bit of a class clown, so that helped. You did that instead of the other stuff.
Good survival mechanism.
Super good survival mechanism. But, I did have teachers who got me up in front of the class, made me read a poem, and would lead the laughter of others. And that was pretty punishing, So when I was accepted into the Sydney Conservatorium, it was on the basis of my capacity to sing. But I went and 3 months before I was due to go to the Sydney Conservatorium, I came home and found Dad dying and couldn't resuscitate him. So this 18-year-old kid inherits a dog, nothing else. We had some difficulty with the house at the time and had to get supports for that and so on. But the small community came together in Kinnibarabran, raised $30,000, got me to Sydney University, got me to St John's College, and fundamentally changed my life from that moment. So for me, community is something else. Something else. That's what community is. It's a broad collection of very different people who, when someone trips, they pick them up. So, I mean, I've rambled on and not really answered your question,
amazing.
but that was kind of
that's
the
a
deal early
tough
on.
start.
It was tough, yeah. But people have much tougher starts. And, I try to keep it in context always. And I wonder whether my dad and my mum would like who's sitting here with you. I will never know. I hope they would. I wonder why I didn't go to drugs and crime and other things, which, are often...
Which a lot of people would have with that background. It would be almost acceptable that if that was the path.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there was something else in you and perhaps that community that meant you've ended up here.
I was very lucky, very lucky. And, there were other people, my co-evils, some of them, who had traumatic lives and took those routes. And once you're down that road, you lose years, minus years, and you've got a long way to fight back. But, I had a profoundly supportive community and they got me to Sydney University and to St John's College, importantly, which exposed me to incredible people, one of whom was Ian McGilchrist, who I think is the smartest person alive, the only person to be a Quondam Fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, and has written extraordinary books, but he changed my world big time. And I became, after that, an autodidact. So I feel still inadequate in an intellectual sense because everything I know, I've taught myself to some degree. I've read myself. I've picked up, Nabokov and Nicomachean Ethics and, all these things and taught myself. So, it's an interesting journey.
You have a Indigenous heritage as well. Was that a prominent feature of your childhood or part of your identity that you were aware of or not really?
It was. So my grandmother on my father's side grew up out near Canamble, and it's interesting that I was caught between two worlds. And this is where this through theme in my life of belonging comes along. So, I don't appear to be Indigenous as you would expect. It is part of me. I always say that. It's part of who I am. When I was growing up, I very much felt it. I grew up in a part of Kinnibarabran with other Indigenous families nearby. There were just things about our growing up that was similar and how our houses operated, all that sort of stuff. Because there is a difference. There is some difference there. The sharing is much deeper of everything. So I experienced that, and I experienced that cultural input, certainly from the Aboriginal Education Officer at the school and other elders, and they informed me about those stories because, what I'd lost is the stories of who I was and where I'd come from. And so that was part of it. But I was also caught between two worlds in the sense that I don't appear to have that heritage. And so people make an either or judgment, which again is part of, an insight into my thinking that people are complicated, effervescent, there's many parts to them, and that if you remove any of the parts, you destroy the whole. You can't examine one of the parts and not see the brilliance of the whole. You've got to take the whole. And
but humans by nature, I suppose, from a psychology point of view, are quick to label because that's the shortcut, right? That's the heuristic. And so they have an image in their head of what the gay man looks like or in the Indigenous person or the kid from the tough background. And if you don't fit that, it's confusing for people.
Very confusing. Yeah. And that's why that whole acronym and all these labels, they're so reductionist. It's a central tenet of McGilchrist's kind of thinking on this, and his writing on it. He fundamentally, through his work, changed the attention I pay to the world. And you can't just label everything and reduce it. There's a beautiful quote, I can never remember who it's by, and I'll probably butcher it, but the moment you teach a young child the name of a beautiful bird, they will never see that bird again.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
Isn't that profound?
That is.
The label wrecks it.
The label wrecks it, yeah.
The label wrecks it. And that's why kids are such fascinating things, because they sort of, their eyes are wide in a philosophical sort of morals, all these senses, and they're just looking about the place and going, where's the truth here? And they see the truth, children, more often than adults do, because we sort of get beaten around by society.
You've said that it took you up to 2 years to write that article for The Australian. And I imagine that was a tough process and an emotional process. But I also imagine that part of that was a certain amount of fear of how it would be received. Just talk to me about that process of coming to this point and saying, I think I do need to say something here, and how it was actually received by people.
So there's a couple of overlays that made me sit and reflect. One, I sat and reflected for 2 years after writing it because I thought, do I have the nub of the truth here? You know, am I moving towards the truth? Right. And
So a certain amount of self-reflective.
I wanted to reflect on that.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted to be sure I was moving towards the truth because I knew for some people reading it, it'd be hurtful. So I wanted to make sure I was moving towards the truth. If you're someone like me who aspires to public life, you've always got to have that consideration. Is this easily, and I think it's good to be very honest about these things, but is this very thoughtful thing that I've written in a very honest way, trying to find a better future, going to be taken out of context easily to injure that prospect of a public life in the future? And that question we can perhaps come to. The other part of it is, again, coming back to belonging. In publishing this, Jack, do you cleave yourself off from the opportunity to belong to that community and that acronym?
Do you really want that?
Do you really want that? And more importantly, does the validity of who you are come from that place? Do you need membership, as it were? So I had to...
There's big questions.
I had to mill all those things, and I ultimately decided that if you believe something to be true, you say it. And I read a little piece about in 1960 when American generals met to talk about their nuclear response strategy. None of them spoke up against killing hundreds of millions of people except the Marine Corps Army general. And he stood up and said, I don't think this is right. We shouldn't be doing this. That's enough. When it matters, you've got to stand up. If you think it's the truth, you've got to say it. And I think the truth always cuts through.
And what was the response?
Well, overwhelmingly positive. Overwhelmingly positive. Some death threats, you get those. Some people telling me to go and swim in shark-infested waters, all that kind of stuff. You know, you get all that. You get called a grub and all sorts of things. Maybe I have some psychological problem, but I kind of enjoy reading the nasty ones. I like to see how creative they can be.
I get that every time I'm in the media and say something and I kind of, look, why are you watching? I find criticism of my public opinion much more harder to take if they're colleagues or they're certainly people I know. But if I don't know them and they're sitting there for the sake of being a keyboard warrior and writing into my office the next day and saying I should be kept away from all children, children should be taken off me, and it's like, wow, okay.
And that, the thing that was painful for me and still is painful, it did have a chilling effect on some personal relationships, friendships and so on. Not major, but some.
Okay.
And it didn't kill them, but it chilled them, and that does wound you a bit. But you've got to push through that. And it wounds me particularly because I tell everyone I'm a sad, lonely person, but when I'm sitting brooding and reading my books and so on, I kind of am, because I don't really have a family structure and all that kind of stuff. So it makes it a bit more acute for me. But I had many transgender people contact me. The basic theme of their contributions, comments was, we want to live our lives. This is great. We don't want to be burdened by this behemoth which claims to speak for us, makes the whole process more difficult. A lot of gay and lesbian people contacted me, and I didn't respond to most of them because I think that's to break some fourth wall. I think you need to leave them with that. So it was interesting. And a lot of older gay men, interestingly, who had suffered a great deal more than I will ever suffer. And their contacting me was great support because I feel this kind of through line of responsibility. Because in their generation, acknowledging that, you look at the 1978 protests, Mardi protests here, there would have been people there who today we would say are transgender people. I mean, it's not to suggest that, I'm not suggesting, as the editor's headline suggests, that, we need to whitewash the show. This community's always been complex and it's always had many parts. And without those activists, we wouldn't be where we are today. But it is to do great injury to their legacy to stop. and think, oh, well, we'll just keep doing what we've always done. We'll keep shouting and we'll keep saying that we're deeply injustice, all this sort of stuff. Much rather to say, okay, well, let's have an honest reflection on this. Is it working? Where are we? What does it look like if we reach equality? On a whole range of questions.
Do you think we've reached equality?
Well, what is it? I mean, that's the first point. We've got to determine what it is. But I think by and large, for gay, lesbian people, bisexual people, yes, legally, socially, we have reached a place of equality. For transgender people, it's a much more difficult assessment because the societal rigidity is tougher. Now, I think if you're an adult, the decisions you make with your doctor and what you want to do in your own best interest of your business, and I'm quite libertarian about these things, you go for your life. The difficulty then comes in the best place for advocacy on those things is between the individuals.
Yes.
Between the individuals. And, there are those who make declarations and say, oh, well, if I meet a transgender person, I'm never going to use their preferred pronouns. That's not the approach I would take. I don't know that person's life and where they've been, and I'm going to come from a place of openness and respect, expecting they will as well. And I think by and large, those are the interactions that take place. Unfortunately, social media and extreme activists paint a very different picture. And what that picture does, I think, is it pre-prejudices the capacity to have the honest, open, respectful conversation.
It shuts it down.
It shuts it down. So I think by and large we have reached equality on many, many of these measures. And I think people should be so provocative as to at least think about, do we need the Mardi Gras anymore? What form does it need to take if we do keep it? Who should be in it? I mean, I'm exposing my politics, but why is Qantas there? Why are all these big corporations there? What are they doing? Do you really think they care about you? Do you really think they're there for the interests of advancing equality? I don't think so. And I think that it's sort of their presence diminishes it somehow. So I think those conversations do justice to the sacrifice of advocates and activists in the past. And to suddenly stop thinking about it evolving is to do a great insult to their legacy.
Yeah, because I suppose the irony is, and if I can get where you're coming from, is that their role and their goals and intent were very much needed at the time. And one would ask now, if we have reached equality, what is the role of the activists now? And the ones that shout loud enough have to find something to shout about. And the irony is that I suppose what do gay people want, and for want of a better terms, to collect you all together, is to live normal lives as like everyone else.
Yeah.
And yet where we've come from is not actually being able to do that. And I wanted to read a small section of what you've written about that I couldn't help chuckle. And I think people listening to this will the same, just be able to take themselves to this point. And this is what Jack has written. He says, take a walk through any major city or observe the busy foyer of large corporate headquarters with its small LGBTQIA+ flags and symbols. Supposedly these are to signal to any passerby that this establishment welcomes those of the acronym. Carrying with them all the hollow corporate virtue, there's utterly devoid of the kind of cultural fullness that one might experience in an old Newtown pub when, upon ordering, you see slung behind the bar a rainbow flag, embodied, embedded into a sense of place and powerful in its context. And I loved that paragraph because I just said before we started recording this, as I reread that paragraph, I got an email from a fellow psychologist that had about at least half a dozen flags at the end of her email sign-off. And it's very hard, as I said to you before this, it's very hard as a straight person, I suppose, to call this out. What's your experience when you walk into a foyer, open an email, scroll down to the bottom of a website as a gay person and see rainbow flags?
Well, there's two things. I think the first point is we've forgotten the kind of inflationary principle that the more you do something, the less it means. And so I think that that's number one. It's very easy to put things in your email signature and have no real connection to that moral position and to those values. I mean, it's the same as someone who said, well, I'm a pacifist. I'd never kill anything. But They do kill cockroaches in their kitchen, for
You've got
example.
some bug spray.
Yeah, they've got some bug spray. So
Because I kind of open that email, or I see businesses like that, and I say, well, what are you saying? Are you saying we will serve gay people?
well,
Okay. I mean,
but
even having to say that is a backward step.
well, that's right. And the corollary is the powerful thing. So I walk along King Street in Newtown, just as an example. And I spent a bit of time there when I was at St John's College. It's an interesting place. But you walk along and you see, particularly in bottle shops, these kind of places, these little sort of pin drop rainbow flags. You're welcome here, effectively.
Up in the corner, sitting there.
Yeah. Now, the corollary of that is, well, I'm obviously not welcome in the places where that isn't, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, problematic part of the logic already. But two, why do I need an indication about where I can go, where I'm permitted to go, on something that is inherently part of my private life?
Mm.
And so this merging of the private and the public, I think, is a very strange thing. So one could be very crass and say, because you engage in this sexual activity and because, you love the person with the same genitals, therefore you come to our establishment. You're welcome.
And that's what it is. And you say that and I laugh, but that is the reductionist nature of it.
It's bizarre. It's bizarre. And surely equality in its purest intent is that I go into that bottle shop. We'll use that example. We're having a good evening. We're having some wine. I go into the bottle shop. I get the bottle of wine. No one in there's any the wiser. The attendant's not any the wiser. They don't care.
Because it
and out I
doesn't
go.
matter.
No.
Exactly.
No.
And that's equality.
I think so. I think so. Equality's boring. It's really boring. And we've
Actually, I really like that. Equality is boring.
It's boring. It's really boring. And you've got to be prepared to be boring, and you're not different to anyone else. And I think there are probably people who are thinking about this, but particularly as Western countries move on these big questions that we agree people need to have equal rights. What does it look like when we get there? I'm very, very interested. I'm a deep student of 1960s America and the politics there. And, I love Lyndon Baines Johnson. I think he's a fascinating political character, and I think I've read just about everything that's been written on him. But he was tasked with ending segregation in the United States. That's why I use the example of Selma, Alabama in the essay. But I wonder whether they were thinking at the time, well, what does it look like when we end segregation in this country? We get the Civil Rights Act in, and where does it go? That's where we should be, I think, to think, well, what does equality look like? Is it a destination? Does it require constant maintenance? Are the historical tools of liberation now impediments to our continued embedded existence in the society? Those are the questions that I'm interested in.
And of course, that goes across the board with other groups, doesn't it? Including Indigenous groups as well. And I've had Indigenous academic Anthony Dillon on this podcast before and saying the same things as you, but particularly with the email signatures and the flags in the shops to say, it shouldn't matter that I'm Indigenous, that I'm welcome into your shop. So this is across the board with other minority groups, anywhere where there is that activism that comes from a very legitimate need to push for equality because there wasn't equality.
Yeah, that's right. And I think too, there's in all these things, if you look at the acronym, and I touched on it earlier, there's a very, intense conversation around the sort of T and the trans element. And I think I always come from a place of respect and openness to start with. And a lot of people don't. But what it does expose, similar to Indigenous questions, is that there is a varying degree of prejudicial conduct. There's a varying degree of sufferance. And if you look at the Indigenous community, for example, I am not as disadvantaged as others. So therefore, I think we can be more nuanced in our response, potentially. And I just think we've become very good, be it at public policy or in social debate, at blunt instruments. You know?
You said that in your article that you were interested in what, I think it's your words, the good life means and how we knit society together towards that goal. What does that mean for you? What does that look like for you?
I think about this a lot, and I'm not going to suggest that I have any great wisdom on it, but I'm sitting here with you, and I'll turn 30 in December, right? And most people listening
10
to
years
this,
on you, Jack, 10 years on you.
Most people listening to this will hear me and think he sounds like a 1950s radio announcer, but that's
great radio voice.
Yeah, not the face. But my friends and I talk about this a lot. And I think we're at a peculiar point where our society is losing its value. And I mean things like beauty and truth, something that Ian McGilchrist talks about, which is a sense of the sacred. Now, I'm not religious. I will defend anyone's right to practice their religion till bloodshed, and I mean that. I think that we can't have these kind of camps that are fighting each other. But for me, a sense of the sacred comes from music, from poetry, and so I fill my life with value in that sense. I try to seek always for truth and to speak the truth. I'm interested in beauty and where we find it and what is good. And really, to me, it's this idea of vanishing shame. Vanishing shame in our society is an indication, I think, that our self's outward actions and expressions don't always accord with our self's moral core and integrity. And that there's a discrepancy there. And we've got to try and arrest that somehow. I'm not sure how we do that. But principally, for me, a good life is my political philosophy. Good, secure job, keep a family together, keep a community strong, connected. The rest tends to take care of itself. There are other big questions we can work on, but those foundational things we've got to get right. And, you see it now. We're a very wealthy country. We've got a whole bunch of young people who aren't going to get into a house. That means they're probably not going to have kids when they should. They're going to have them much later. They're not going to be as embedded in communities if they're renting and moving all the time. I think those base things we've got to think about and pay more attention to. You'll hear politicians bleat all the time about social cohesion, we've got to stick together, all this sort of stuff. What are we really doing to get there? And are we thinking about it on the individual level? Are we saying, as a population, which I think we should, that we want to get to a place where an individual is more concerned with the quality of their goals than the quantity of goods? That's where we want to get to. But unfortunately, you've got to get enough surplus in time, in energy, in money, in individuals where they can say to themselves, I want to be more concerned with the quality of my goals than the quantity of my goods. And to me, that's, those are some of the highlights of what it is to
It's a good way
life.
to conceptualise it, because I do think at the moment with individuals particularly, or anyone around 30 years old, looking at what's ahead of them at the moment, particularly if they're living in Sydney, where we are today, that they're far more concerned about the quantity of goods, aren't they, than the quality of life. But they don't have the opportunity to look at the quality of life there.
No.
They're paddling away and keeping their head above water.
Just keeping their head above water. And, John Ralston Saul wrote a magnificent book in the 90s, I think, maybe the 80s, called The Unconscious Civilization. And it deals with, in part, that theme that if you don't give people the surplus to be able to engage at another level, then things really start to fall down and it becomes the social media is in that and technology and there's lots of things going on. It's not an easy fix. But we do seem to live in a world where the quantity of your goods is more important than your relationships and the quality of your goals. And we suffocate any kind of sufferance in technology and outrage and all these other things. And I think part of that is why you have some very extreme activists on these questions today. And they're normally younger people. That's not surprising. But I think they're in search of purpose, search of meaning, and this gives them purpose and meaning, whether it be misguided or not. And so I think that those big things are the things we're missing. We've got plenty of power to do stuff, We need more time to think about it, contemplate it, figure out where we're going, what it means to be human. What does it mean to be human, really? I know it sounds so silly.
But when we look at the concept of community, I mean, myself who works with young people every day and families, and I'm a staunch kind of advocate, if you want to use that word, or supporter of traditional family structures, but they are looking for community, but they're looking for community online. That community online is very different to the community you described growing up. Like you couldn't get more polar opposites
that's right.
The algorithm-fed community that you stumble into.
That's right.
But at the end of the day, you asked what it is to be human. We are pack animals who need to connect, don't we?
We do. We need to connect. Human connection, authentic human connection. I mean, I use that term in the essay. It's a powerful term. I mean, authentic. There's a great, I'm sure you'd be interested in, Jonathan Haidt, he's just a genius person, and he's written a great deal about the anxious generation, and also The Righteous Mind is a magnificent book too about this.
Has instrumentally changed the way your parents are thinking these days by one book.
Fantastic book. I mean, I've written all over it. There's more of my pen markings in there than his text. But, one of the things I think about in terms of human connection, and it relates, I think, to people, young gay people and others coming to terms with things. But, in Japan, they have kintsugi. And when a piece of pottery falls on the ground and breaks, they don't throw it away. They pick it up and they put it back together, but with gold-laden sort of glue, plaster. And so the breakage becomes the beautiful thing. And I think that we've lost that art in our human relation. I had a friend during COVID, very dear friend, who was, and I hope you won't mind me saying this, but he was unbelievably radical and kind of conspiratorial on the whole situation. But we maintained our friendship. We came from polar opposite positions on that, and we had some big blues on it, but we both remained open to each other. And our relationship and friendship as a consequence of that difficulty is unbelievably stronger, so much more beautiful.
That is such an element in art. And I know a lot of people talk about it nowadays, but I think it still is worth talking about the fragility of the human connection in the polarization of where we're at. And you mentioned about perhaps putting some strain on some friendships after you published that article. I've certainly had some friends disappear and quite abruptly after political views expressed. And I think we're heading down a very dangerous path if that's the case. So I love that people in particularly polar ends of the political spectrum can have robust arguments and then crack another bottle of wine and carry on with their night. I remember growing up, mum voting one way and dad voting the other and then sitting down to dinner.
Fine.
I mean, it was fine. It didn't matter. They both expressed that's why they did what they did and that was fine. And I can't see that happening now in a family.
Well, we've become very incapable of understanding, and again, this is a McGilchrist thing, but, I hope people will go and read his stuff, but, we've become very incapable of one, remaining with the question, but two, appreciating that the answer to any question might be A and not A at the same time. Yeah. And those two things exist together. And so everything becomes yes, no. So, well, you don't believe the same thing as me, or I'm cutting you out of my life. I'm slicing you off. I think that's a terrible way to live. And I've had a fair bit of loss. I mean, everyone who's ever loved me has died, right? So, that's a warning to anyone who wants to fall in love with me. You probably cop it in the neck at some point. But, I mean, dad goes, mum goes, the dog goes, I mean, everyone who's ever loved me dies. And so I have some understanding of loss. And it's given me a deep appreciation for relationships with other human beings, be they intimate, familial, whatever. You've got to maintain them and work at them, and they're hard. And people are weird. I mean, I'm weird, you're weird. We've all got these sort of complex parts of our nature and idiosyncrasies that we've got to work through them, And if we disconnect from one another and we cut each other off so easily, the place falls apart.
It just comes back to your initial reductionist argument when I had a friend who did give me the credit of telling me that we can no longer be friends anymore because of your expressed views on American politics. I did feel very was that all you saw in me? Was there no other benefits to our friendship? Am I now just a walking label of that particular view? Was there no joy in the meals we've had together or the activities we've done? And I can agree not to talk about American politics if that makes you more comfortable. But are you willing to give up 99.99999% of everything else there is about me? And so in that moment in time, I was reduced to one view on one particular topic.
Yeah. And it's a scourge across our whole society. People are, and I keep repeating it, they're complicated. There's lots of parts of them. And I have friends who don't agree with my political position on many things. Now, I'm very forthright, refuse to kind of take a backward step. But
that's my problem. I've found my problem, Jack.
But you gather a few people in your life sometimes, a core group of people, whom you can say anything to, and it's okay. And I take that approach with everyone. I mean, there is not a topic you could raise with me where I'm not prepared to engage you on it, honestly, and have a conversation. And we may disagree furiously and be at polar ends of it, but I'm very prepared to talk to you about it. And it won't compromise our relationship, because I think that's actually the stuff of building relationships.
Correct.
And if you want to go out in the world and say, well, I only want people in a room who agree with me, what a boring life that'd be. I mean, it'd be just terrible. I want people who challenge me and provoke me. And I've had some fabulous responses to the essay where people have made me think, maybe I got that wrong or so on. That's great.
Great.
That's great. That's the stuff.
Else, how do we move forward?
That's the stuff. That's the stuff.
And so to finish off and come full circle, in this idea of community, is there room for community in the acronym, for want of a better word? Your article in some ways was suggesting that should be dismantled. You've said today, do we need to have the conversation? Is the Mardi Gras relevant? For a young person particularly who may be struggling with their sexual identity and is looking for community, is that where they should be headed? Is it still needed?
I would say to any young person who's sort of coming to terms with their sexuality or is in those early phases, one, we have to acknowledge that every circumstance will be different. Every individual's experience will be different and the people around them will be different. But I think as a general rule, you're in control. You're in control of the information. You're in control of how you communicate it. You don't have to, in order to be a legitimate, valid human being, have to have had a horrible coming out story. So don't go looking for it. Don't go looking for it. If it happens to knock upon your door, then you take it as it comes. But don't fabricate it. Don't go looking for it. Don't unnecessarily cut off people if you don't need to. Try to keep again, you're in control of the information. Try to keep those relationships, as we've said, when they become difficult. But I think really the central point for me, for young gay people coming to terms with it all, is that your validity as a human being and all the beautiful things you can bring to the world are not defined by your sexuality, and they are not diminished by the fact that you keep your private life. You keep your private life. I mean, when things are kept in reserve, they're kept privately for the eyes of a few, they're much richer. Now, I'm not saying you live in the closet the rest of your life. You be who you are. You are a gay person in the modern world or a transgender person in the modern world.
But you don't have to, if you don't want to, walk down the street with a rainbow flag T-shirt.
You don't. You don't have to walk down the road with a rainbow flag T-shirt. Go and read Christopher Hitchens' Letters to a Young Contrarian. Try and sit on the outside a bit and don't assume for a moment, don't fall for it, that because the local council's painted a rainbow crossing on the street, that's somehow some great act that sees you. Nobody's going to see you unless you go out and do something in the world, and you can do that without it being all linked to your sexuality. You just do it as you. You're enough. You're enough.
Well, that seems like a really good place to stop. I think this conversation, it's refreshing, not just the content, but the ability to think deeply about topics, to reflect, to share ideas, to not have clickbait all the time, and to sit with things. And they evolve and you can reflect again and come to different viewpoints, and they can change and you can change your view. I like that message too.
Yes.
You can change your view on things. Thank you so much. This has been great. Thank you so much for giving up your valuable time and joining me today on the couch. If today's conversation spoke to you, consider sharing the love and send it to someone you know who needs to hear it. Don't forget you can watch this full episode on my YouTube channel. And if you've enjoyed today's conversation, all I ask is that you hit that subscribe button. It helps us to be able to deliver bigger and better content to you absolutely free of charge. If you've got comments or questions about today's episode, head on over and come hang out on Instagram, where you can follow and contact me. Okay, stay curious, stay connected, and join me next time on the couch. Take care. Okay, for those who've made it this far, just remember, even though I am actually a registered and qualified psychologist, this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered professional individual advice.